Hi students, it's Professor Franovich here at Holyoke Community College, and I am going to talk about roots today. So we left off talking about tissues, and now we are looking at different parts of the plant body. Roots' main function is to anchor and support the plants. This is a cool scene that you often see on trails or in the forests around New England, where a big rock, maybe a glacial erratic rock, has been surrounded by roots. Roots can grow above ground as well as underground, and that might be new to you. They're not always found underground, and they have many modifications. So we're going to look at the tissues that make up roots and how they're organized, and then we'll look at some differences in different types of roots. Roots not only function in anchoring the plant, but they also absorb water and minerals from the soil. And here you can see the root systems of two different types of plants. Here is a bean seed, and the roots coming down here, and whoa, look at this. The bean seed is actually the first set of leaves that sprout. So what's happening here is the root comes down first, answering this question here, which emerges first, root or the shoot, and then the root branches out and forms a very branched root system. We call that a fibrous root system. When it first emerges, it's called a radicle. Down here is corn seed, showing this also. Roots come out, and look how long they get before the first shoot comes out. When we do a cross-section of a root, we can see that it's made up of many cells and some different cell types. Highlighted in the picture on the right is the dermal tissue, the ground tissue, and the vascular tissue. So each little bit here, each little outline is a cell. And so these are all cells of ground tissue out here, vascular tissue in the middle, and dermal tissue on the outside. You'll notice the very, very tip is a different color. That's the root cap, and that's an area where many of the cells are dead on the root cap, and is protection for the zone of cell division that extends the root deeper into the soil. So the zone of cell division is where we see a lot of cells going through mitosis, making copies of themselves, and that's where all the growth happens. The root cap protects that growth as it pushes through the soil. If we were to look through a microscope, we would see cells in various stages of division here. That's called mitosis, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. And here's the root cap protecting that area. That was a longitudinal section. Let me skip back there. Longitudinal sections are cut the long way, and it's important to distinguish that between what we see here, which is a transverse or cross section. So we get different views of the roots and really the whole plant if we do these two different sections. We could also think of this as ourself. We could do a longitudinal section of our body, and we could see imagine cutting myself in half the long way, seeing the brain, the throat, and the lungs and all the organs that way. Or we can do a cross section this way where you only see the stomach and the lungs, perhaps. So different views of the body of the plant. This is a cross section of a dicot root. Sometimes that's called Dicot. I learned it as dicot, so that's what I'll say as my default. So a cross section going right across. The root is like coming down like this. We're slicing it here and looking at what we can find. So we have epidermis on the outside, epidermal cells. There is cortex here. Okay, and this is ground tissue. And then the vascular cylinder is in the middle. And this is typical of a dicot root. It'll always be like this. Might not be as clear as this beautiful picture, but in the center you will see a ring of cells That's the endodermis. Then there is the pericycle just inside that. And we have phloem pushing in to the red stained xylem. The xylem are larger cells and they form an X, like X for xylem, in the middle of the vascular tissue. A monocot root is different. And just to distinguish these two, dicots have 2 seed leaves. That's where the di comes from in dicot. It stands for kind of dicotyledon, 2 seed leaves. So when the bean sprouts, bean is a dicot, this shoot will come up, and then the cotyledons, the 2 sides of the bean, will separate. Those are the cotyledons. Monocots are a single cotyledon. So when the shoot comes up, it's just one pointy seed leaf coming up. Corn, grasses are monocots. You probably already looked at this picture while I was talking, and you noticed that we have some similarities and some differences. Here we have the cross-section with the epidermis on the outside, the cortex, endodermis, pericycle just inside that, and then we have not a cross, but a monocot has a ring, like mono has O's in it, ring of xylem. It's not an X, but a ring. And then the phloem is the cells that are kind of in between these rings, poking here and here. Okay? It's a tough distinction. It's hard to tell exactly what's phloem versus the pith sometimes. Here we have nice staining and it's shown as darker. The phloem is kind of darker in this picture and the pith is wide open. So we can see that distinction. When you look at a cross-section of a monocot root under the microscope, it's a little less distinct. And that's okay. Really, what we need to know here is that the phloem transports food, dissolved food, and liquids throughout the plant, and that's its function. When the plant is active and alive, the phloem is doing that, and the pith is not doing that. Okay, so distinguishing between the 2 different cells is difficult when the plant is dead and just sliced in half like this. So, see if you can distinguish these 2 side by side. I find these pictures to be beautiful. And over here on the left, we've got our X of the xylem, so that tells us dicot. And here we have the circle, looks like lace. That's a monocot root. Now, I wanted to point out that these are just the roots. We were going to see some different configurations for the stems. So what is all this? Well, we have our epidermis. That is our outer coating, protects the rest of the root. The cortex makes up the bulk of this root. Water will be transported through the epidermis, through the cortex, into the vascular system of the root. Now, the endodermis controls the movement of waters and solutes into the stele, which is the region inside the endodermis. So we have the endodermis kind of protecting a layer of cells that distinguishes and protects the stele. Just inside that is the pericycle. So here's what we see with the endodermis. Xylem's inside, cortex outside. Minerals can't go between the cells. Minerals have to go through the cells. The cell walls have pores to them, and the membrane has pores to them, so minerals can be transported through. The cell membrane proteins determine which minerals can be taken up. So we have to have selective transportation here. Lateral roots arise from within the pericycle. So that's its main function. The pericycle acts as a meristem, meaning that it reproduces and goes through a lot of cell division for growth, and that's where we have the growth of these emerging roots from the pericycle. It's the outermost layer in the vascular cylinder just under the endodermis. So some fun stuff. So we have some specialized roots here that transform our idea of roots. That's what this is showing, one of those transformer cars. So these are some roots that you might not think of as roots. Storage roots. Well, these you probably do think of as roots. Carrots, sweet potatoes, and sugar beets are all modified roots in that they contain a lot of starches and hold a lot of starches for the plant. These starches can then be used in the next growing season for energy. They could send up the sugars from the roots up to the rest of the plant to sprout and grow. Aerial roots are one of those tricky types of roots that look like stems. These are roots coming down from the branches of a banyan tree. Now, how do we know that they're not stems? Well, they look a little different than the branches and the main trunk of this tree, but also if we slice them through, we would see the configuration of vascular tissue of a dicot root. So it would have the xylem in the X formation, and that's different than what we will see in the shoot, in the stem. Mistletoe is an interesting parasitic plant, and it's parasitic with aerial roots that grow on the tops of trees in the canopy of a forest. These roots will penetrate a branch of a tree and absorb the nutrients and water from that tree. Though mistletoe has this really kind of romantic story where you kiss under the mistletoe around Christmas time, but it's actually a parasitic plant that does a lot of damage to its host. Some other aerial roots are shown here. These are prop roots and pneumatophores. You don't really have to know that term pneumatophore. It's a specialized type of root. This is a mangrove, and there are lots of mangroves in Puerto Rico and down around Florida. It's more tropical, and these are little roots that are coming up for the tree, propping it up, keeping it steady. So it not only anchors but props this tree. And another example of aerial roots is poison ivy. This is a plant that grows near us in our region in the Northeast and is toxic. The good saying is, don't be a dope, don't touch the hairy rope. If you see a hairy rope growing up a tree, it's poison ivy roots, most likely. Here, this is cut off, but this is showing some of the leaves of poison ivy. Leaves of 3, let it be. The contractile roots of skunk cabbage and daffodils are a fascinating adaptation to cold winters. These roots shorten and thicken to pull the plants deeper into the soil when it's winter time. Skunk cabbage is an excellent plant. It's so cool, and I'll put a link to a video on skunk cabbage on our Moodle site. It's shown over here. It's one of the first wild plants to emerge in the springtime because the contractile roots pull it into the soil. They can easily release it back above ground when the soil warms up. Here's a strangler fig tree growing on a wall with some excellent aerial roots. Now, please check our Moodle site and don't forget to read the chapter in your textbook about roots. Thank you, and email me if you have any questions.